Welcome to the Bird Podcast. I'm Shobha Narayan. Our guest today is Dr. Yaara Aharon Rotman. Dr. Rotman is originally from Israel and has completed her PhD from Deakin University in Australia, where she studied long-distance migratory shorebirds. And inspired by these her studied species, she then joined research labs in Israel to work on migratory passerines, and then also in China, where she worked on a vulnerable Asian habitat for migratory geese. And then finally in Australia, which is her current home, where she studies torpor in local and migratory species as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of New England. Dr. Rotman's main interest focuses on how animals and birds, mainly migratory species, respond to challenges, and specifically their physiological adaptations to global changes. When she's not looking for birds in the field or analyzing data in the office, you can find Dr. Rotman at one of the national parks around Armidale, where she's based with her family, or at the boxing ring. Welcome, Dr. Rotman, and thank you for being part of the Bird Podcast.
Thank you, Sheba. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be with you here.
Yes. You mentioned that you started working with birds by chance, and I was just curious how that happened.
Yeah, funny, because I never thought that I will have my career on researching birds, and because I studied with geography in urban planning. That's what I thought I want to be. But then I thought that I really want to be more with wildlife, and I want to work more understanding animals, understanding how they react to all global changes. And when I started to look for my PhD, I wanted to do it somewhere else, abroad, so not in Israel. And I found a really neat project in Australia with Professor Marcel Klassen, who was my supervisor. And he worked on long-distance migratory shorebirds. And I thought, that sounds really interesting. And I applied, I got it, and I found myself in Australia learning a lot about birds, about migration, shorebirds. And I think that was a very good decision that I made.
Can you tell us about what do you mean by long-distance migratory shorebirds, at least from your standpoint?
Yeah, so when I say long distance, it's really long distance. So the shorebirds that I studied from Australia, they migrate from Southern Australia or from New Zealand all the way to the Arctic, to Russia and Alaska. They stop multiple times on the way to refuel. So in Asia, in China, Taiwan, Russia. So they make really long trips every year. So there are species that do short distance migration, so inside the continent, but these birds every year cover this distance, which is like 30,000 kilometers, something really long. But the benefits are really good for them. So because when winter starts in the southern hemisphere, it's really cold, and energetically it's really expensive. So they really look for places where conditions are much better for them. So in the northern hemisphere, summer just started, so they have lots of food. The weather is better, so they don't have to spend lots of energy on thermoregulation, and also in search for good breeding conditions, so for good breeding spots.
What is thermoregulation?
So when it's really cold, we need to warm ourselves, so we have endotherms and ectotherms. So endotherms are like humans, so we produce our heat. So our body temperature is constant. So if it goes up or down by 2 degrees, it's catastrophic for us. And this means that if it's really cold outside, we have to spend lots of energy on maintaining stable temperature. And also many animals are endotherms. So birds and mammals, not reptiles. So reptiles are ectotherms. So they use the sun to warm up. So if you need to, if you're in a really cold place, you need to thermoregulate, which means that you have to spend lots of energy so you can maintain your body temperature. But if you move to a warmer place, then you don't have to spend so much energy. Then it means that you are saving some energy. if you notice, sometimes when it's really cold, we eat a bit more because we want to have more energy for thermoregulation. And when it's warm outside, we don't need all these calories. We don't need all this energy.
So, and unlike us, the birds can't put on layers and layers of clothes. So for them, thermoregulation is a harder thing, isn't it?
It is, but although they can't put up lots of clothes, they do put up lots of weight. So if you look at migratory birds, I specifically talk about shorebirds because that was what I studied, but for example, the Ruddy turnstones. So you look at a turnstone after they finish their migration, and they weigh about, I think, 100 grams, 120 grams. And before they start the migration, because they have to spend lots of energy also for flying for the migration itself, they eat a lot. They go through a phase of about 2 months that they constantly eating, feeding, and they put a lot of weight, and they reach to almost 200 grams. So they really look like a round ball. So they don't put lots of clothes on them, but a lot of fat. So the fat content is really, really high, which is about equivalent to put a few sweaters for us when it's really cold.
What are some examples of these extreme migrations that birds are doing? And also, what are the species that you study?
Yeah, so there are many examples for really long distance. So there's the Arctic tern, and I studied mainly ruddy turnstones, but we have also the bar-tailed godwit, which is the champion of migration. So we call them the athletes. And also lots of other shorebird species like the curlew sandpiper and redknot and greatknot. And you can find them all around the world. So also migrating from Africa to Europe and in the Americas, from the south to north. And so the bar-tailed godwit, for example, they fly from South Australia and New Zealand. They stop on the way in Korea, South Korea, North Korea, and fly to Alaska. And then on the way down, they fly non-stop from Alaska, almost all the way down. They stop in a few islands north of New Zealand, but it's really, really long distance. And can I show you a short animation? So that's an example of the migration of the bar-tailed godwit. These are a few individuals here. The animation made a good friend of mine, Simon Lisowski. And it's in combination from data that he got from other researchers. All the credit is here. And it's mainly to show, well, first where they migrate, but also how they use the wind conditions throughout the migration. And I think it's really cool because first, it's pretty amazing, the long distance. So these are individuals from New Zealand. They fly all the way to China and Korea. And you can also see in this animation, so the green is vegetation and the white is snow, because in the Northern Hemisphere, it was winter and it's now spring. So now the snow starts to thaw, and they arrive exactly in synchrony with the vegetation growth. So this is how important it is for them, because they're crossing the globe to the other side, but they have to arrive just on time for these conditions. So you can see also these are the wind patterns, and they're really using the wind to cross the oceans and to arrive just on time when the vegetation starts to grow. And these are really, really long distance migrations. So they fly here from Asia, from Korea, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, all the way to Alaska. These are the times, by the way, here. So this is May. They arrive just on time for the breeding. And now we see the south migration. So this is September. And they just cross the ocean from north to south.
Wow.
Yeah, and here arrive all the way down to New Zealand and Australia.
My word, that's what you mean.
So this is pretty long, huh? Is this good?
Yeah. What is this? This is the ruddy turnstone.
Yeah. So that's the ruddy turnstones. So they also are champion migrants. So they fly nonstop from South Australia to Taiwan first, most of them. And then from Taiwan, they do lots of other steps, right? China to go all the way to the Arctic, to the Russian Arctic. And we used geolocators to track their migration. So in Australia, there are waders study groups. There's groups of volunteers that monitor and catch waders throughout the years, mainly during the summer when most of the migrants came back. They are doing an amazing job, and we join them a lot to get lots of data and help them with the catching. And then we put these geolocators, these small devices. Now the geolocators, what they do is that they capture the light. So, and these are archive devices. So it means that we have to capture the bird, then download the data, and then we can analyze it and see how their migration route looked like. And it's not so accurate like the GPS. So we have about 200 kilometers of error, but in these long distances, so it's not that bad.
So Dr. Rotman, the bar-tailed godwit migration, which you just showed in the animation, and also the Ruddy turnstone, which you study, what are some differentiators of these champion migrators? How are they different?
Yeah, so how come they're so good at what they're doing, you probably mean, because, so I guess first it's the using the strategy. So they are, their ability to change the weight so quickly. So their ability to feed a lot before migration. So they can double their weight, so they can burn all the fat during migration. Using the wind conditions to assist them in migration. There are also some studies about how they use the brain. So I think it was for Ruddy turnstone, I'm not sure, because they fly nonstop for days. So Ruddy turnstone, for example, fly for 6 days nonstop from Australia to Taiwan. And it's really amazing how they have to have some kind of rest. How could they fly for like 6 days? So they're probably using something like half asleep. So half of the brain is asleep while the other one is awake. So they use some kind of these strategies. Also, probably before they start their migration, they can shrink or decrease the size of the organs that are not so relevant for the migration. So, example, the liver. So before migration, so when they have to feed a lot, it has a really important role. But while migrating, so it's mainly the muscles. So the liver can shrink a bit more. Organs that are not so essential for flight will decrease in size. And when they arrive exhausted, they start to rebuild all these organs and the muscles and prepare for the breeding season. And then after the breeding, they start again. So preparing for their migration, using all this fat and all this muscle, and they eat specific types of food that they can give them enough fat and energy for all this migration. And yeah, it's still pretty remarkable. I guess the more we learn, the more we know that we don't know enough, and we need to understand it a bit more, and we can learn from them so much.
Yeah, in your website, yaararotman.com, which we will link to, you talk about how migration is physiologically extremely challenging. It's a life strategy in which time and energy expenditures must be balanced, which is, I guess, what you just said, which is losing the organs that are useless at that time and then regaining them back when they need it.
Yeah.
And then you also say, I'm interested in heterothermy in relation to the energetics of bird movement. What does that mean?
Okay. Before can I add more about the time and energy balance, because
sure.
Some aspects that I'm really interested in is how the environment affects this. So when we saw that they cross so many continents, boundaries, and the environment is changing all the time. And when I said that they have to prepare for the migration, so they have to feed a lot, but it really depends on the conditions that they have. So if, for example, they overwinter, they spend the winter in South Australia in a place, but then the place really deteriorates and they don't have enough food. So it will mean that they're not able to feed enough to put all this fat and to prepare for migration. And that's another aspect that I'm really interested in. And we also worked with passerine flying from Africa to Europe. because conditions are changing all the time. And in Africa, there's lots of agriculture also. So they're changing the environment. And there used to be a few years with the drought. And then it means that really the birds really find it difficult to feed enough. And we can see it with the numbers that are stopping on the way. So when we say about the time minimization and energy minimization, it's also arriving on time for food abundance in the next stop, because they have so many stops on the way and they have to arrive just on time. Because if they arrive and the food is gone, or the snow haven't started to melt and it's still freezing, so they don't have anything to feed on. So I think it's a very gentle system, but very robust at the same time. And that's, I guess, the main thing for long distance migrants with global changes. So so if in the north the snow starts to thaw earlier because of global warming, so it means that if the migrants arrive later, so maybe they miss the peak of the food availability. And these are things that I think really needs to be dealt with now, to understand how we can help them, how we can understand how it affects the migration.
One of our earlier guests in the podcast series was Dr. Erica Knoll, and she talks about how the Arctic has been documented to be melting 3 weeks earlier. And so, as you said, the birds arrive, they have their own calendar and they arrive.
Yeah.
And already, yeah. And I think what your research has shown me certainly how everybody uses the word complex for migration, and it's really what you say is at every stage to show up. We talk about living with the seasons, and as humans we think, oh yeah, we should buy seasonal fruit, but these guys are timing their migration.
Yeah, exactly.
To come
and you think that migrants fly from Africa or from Australia or South America all the way to the Arctic, so they really have no idea what the conditions are at the end of the route. So if they fly from South Africa and they breed in northern Austria or even in England, so if the summer started really early that year, or there are extreme conditions in that year and they just arrive and they're exhausted from the long flight, and they have to really quickly gain back all the energy. So that's, I think, a real challenge.
What are the names of, or what are the species of passerine? You said the passerine birds that you study?
Yes, so we work with blackcaps, different species of warblers.
Okay, how do you spell Dr. Rotman? Black.
How do you spell what? Blackcap, Eurasian blackcap, so black CAP.
Blackcaps, yeah.
Blackcap, yeah. Mm-hmm. And a different species of warblers. And shrike, so masked shrike as well was, so they fly all the way from South Africa to Europe. Olive tree warbler, olivaceous warblers.
These are tiny birds then.
Yes, these are really tiny birds, and for these birds, so I studied them on their stopover site in Israel. So they stop on the way in Israel, and there are lots of birders in Israel that vendors. There are a few big centers in Israel that capture birds on the migration, and they have lots of data for like 20, even more than 20 years of many species of birds that they ban and they monitor throughout the year. So we can learn a lot from their migration. So we can see their condition when they arrive to Israel, or the timing, how they change the timing. So for example, it was very obvious that there was 1 year with drought in Africa, and most of the birds were very late because probably they didn't have enough food to gain, and they had to spend more time in searching for food and gain more fat before they start their migration. So we can really see how the conditions in the south, so over the winter period, affect their timing of migration, and then probably affect the time they arrive at the breeding ground. So it is all very a long and very complex link that we need to see how each link affect the whole system.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like without borders. We think here in India, if we save certain lakes and preserve certain habitats for birds, it's helpful. But it's not just India for us. I mean, from your research, Africa has to work with Israel, has to
exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And one of the papers for my PhD, I was working on exactly that. So looking at, so we have different sites, and what happens if one site really deteriorates or is gone. For example, because in South Korea there were a few habitats that they were just destroyed. So what happened if this site is gone? Are the birds able to skip this site? Are they able to overpass it to find another one? Or if two? So it's a really matter of a holistic way to look at their life strategy, to look at how they react to changes along the route.
And how do they are they able to skip the sites?
So what we did was modeling. So according to the birds' different characteristics that we know, we did some modeling to see how they react. And obviously it will change between species. Some species are a bit more robust, and some species are more they have their own way, a bit more less flexible, and you can see it with numbers. So redknots, for example, the numbers really decline, and that's probably a lot because of lots of changes that happened along the Yellow Sea. The Yellow Sea is in the middle between China, North Korea, and South Korea. And lots of changes to habitats happened there, and they lost lots of habitats. And probably this is why the numbers really declined of species that were dependent on these sites. And there are quite a few papers about that they did lots of modeling and fieldwork to see how the numbers changes and which sites are using. And we can really obviously see that the distraction of some sites along the way will have an effect on the whole population.
No, I was thinking about the African birds that you said because of the drought in Africa, they started the migration late. As humans, now we know where the sites are robust. So I was just thinking if there was a way to push these birds, leave here because there's no food here, go further out.
Yeah, just go off it.
Through the morning, but they don't, the birds, their a sense of time is so different from ours, isn't it?
Yeah, and they're using their cues. So for example, to start migration, again, for each species is a bit different, and there are lots of really great studies about different species and how they use these cues to start migration. And some are so they all have some kind of internal clock. So they know, example, around April, according to probably the position of the sun and the temperature and the air humidity and speed. So they know that, okay, this is time to go on north migration. But it's also, they are affected by the food availability. And so there are lots of other, there are internal cues, but also external cues for when to leave. So although they can't maybe understand and know exactly, okay, we need to go there, but they have these specific cues that they just react to these cues.
Yeah. So you talked about your work in China and how the habitat changed. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience working in China? And first of all, what was the wetland that you worked on, and what were the species that used the wetland, and tell us about you there.
Okay, yeah, so in China it's a bit of a different work. So before I worked on shorebirds and small passerine, and here we worked mainly with geese. But the main work was about changes of the wetland. So there's the Poyang Lake, which is a really big lake, very internationally important along the Yangtze River in China.
How do you
and
spell
it's been used, the Yangtze River?
No, the Yangtze River.
The lake,
yes.
The lake, Poyang Lake, Poyang, Poyang, yeah. So the Poyang Lake is really internationally important for many migratory water birds. So they use it on the way south and north, and lots of also resident birds. And along the Yangtze River, there are lots of dams that were built, and there was a plan to build a big dam as well on this wetland. And the unique thing about this lake it's the seasonality changing the water level. So during winter, water level drops, and it exposed lots of mud flats, and it was really, really rich for lots of birds. And during the summer, so water level increase. And what the dam would do if they would build a dam was that water level will remain high. So it means that it wouldn't expose lots of really, really important resources for long distance migratory birds, but also resident and short distance migrants. And our work was mainly to see what would be the effect. So again, we did some modeling according to some data that we had before about where they feed exactly. I think it was, so they haven't built a dam. I think that the plan is always, they raise a plan, and then lots of environmentalists and scientists jump and say, look, it's going to have major implications. And I hope it's not going to happen, because from what we saw, it really have a big impact. And we just talked about it, that this is just one link. So if we really destroy one link, it will have an effect on the whole system. And I think it was really important experience for me, because first it was to work on a very, very important wetland. And I really felt that, okay, as a scientist, sometimes we write papers and we do this work, but we really want to see the effect. We really want to see the results of the things that we say, that we research. And to actually say, okay, this is a very, very important issue. So we want to save these birds. We want to protect this area. And it was also just interesting to work in a very different country, with different culture, and really to work where all these birds that I studied before and just read about and saw the pictures, to actually see to actually be there. So I think it was a really important experience. It also helped me as a researcher to understand the actual implications of what we do. So to see that we're not just researching and writing papers, but we can actually make a difference, or we can actually do what we believe in. So to conserve, to fight for habitats of the animals, and so that there are some implications for our work, for what we do.
You are unusual among our guests because you're familiar with 3 cultures. Now you've talked about your work in China, then Israel and Australia. What is the culture of, not necessarily birding or towards birds, if you can say, in China? How is the feeling? And also Israel and also Australia. What are some differences and similarities in these cultures?
I think first, the similarity is that in each country or each culture, you can find the group of people that care, that the people that will defend, that the people that really are willing to put on this effort and the work to protect the environment. And I guess the main difference is how maybe how hard it is to do this in terms of the government, in terms of the people around. I guess it's hard to answer that because I'm in a university and I'm with researchers, and the people that I work with, they're all in my mindset, and we are all in the same. So the people around me think the same as me, obviously. And in each country, you have this group of people, and you have the funds to do that, which was great.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I understand, because each country values, usually the culprit is quote unquote development, and how each country values economic and human development versus preservation of habitat. And that's a tough one for a scientist like you to answer. That's not a fair question. But ask you about your takeaways. Is there anything you do differently in your life? Because I was thinking, you see these massive physiological adaptations that the birds make. Is there something that we humans can learn from them about? I mean, maybe you mentioned torpor and
oh yeah, we can talk about Torpor as well, but the first thing that came to my mind is that we should all just migrate according to the season and just enjoy spring and autumn. If we can just, well, in Armidale where I live at the moment, it's winter and it's really freezing cold. So sometimes I think, oh, maybe this time of the year I should migrate to India or to Israel to enjoy some sun.
Birds are lucky, no? In that way, they can do this.
Yeah, they can just, if conditions are not so good, not so pleasant, let's just move to the other continent when it's much more pleasant and warm. Or they can use Torpor.
So let's talk about that.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I switched a bit so my plan was actually to merge between migration and Torpor, because I was always interested in how physiologically they do it, how they migrate, because it is very challenging on the body energetically. And I haven't managed to get into the research on Torpor in migratory birds. It was the plan during COVID, but the COVID limited our mobility around. So at the moment I study Torpor in birds, in local birds here in Australia, in New South Wales, where we live. And that's a really cool strategy to deal with tough conditions, with the cold mainly. Torpor can also be used with really warm conditions, and I did a short study with marsupials that did Torpor during hot conditions. But mainly when we talk about Torpor, this is a strategy to cope with very extreme weather conditions or with lack of food. So I worked with few bird species here, so with yellow robins and with tree creepers, white-throated tree creepers. And here in Armidale where we live, it's pretty high, so we are elevation around 1,000, and the winter is really cold, so the nights are really cold. The days can be really nice, but nights go below zero, so around -5. And obviously also food availability is lower for the birds. And one strategy is just to use Torpor. So during the nighttime, during the rest phase, so they drop their metabolism. So everything is very, very slow. It's and then it means that they also save the energy because the difference between the body temperature and the outside temperature is not as high as if they were need to defend high body temperature. And Anusha probably talked exactly about all the mechanism and what Torpor is. So there are very, very different types of Torpor. So like the hummingbirds that Anusha is working on, they're crazy. So they drop temperature to like, I think 4 degrees, if I'm correct. So the birds that we use here, that we studied here, they only drop temperature by 7 or 10 degrees, which doesn't sound a lot, but it is. It's saving lots of energy. And it really helps them, that's probably the easiest strategy to conserve energy, because then they don't have to feed so much to compensate for the energy that they have to expend on thermoregulation. We don't know exactly yet how often they do it, if they do it throughout the whole winter, if it's only on very cold night, or it's only in places where food availability is limited. We do know that, so I studied, for example, the eastern yellow robins, and there was another study that studied Torpor in eastern yellow robins in Western Australia, in the other part of Australia, but they didn't use Torpor, but our birds did. Yeah, so there's probably also, it makes sense that it's the effect of the environment. So if it's a very, very cold environment, if the temperature are very extreme between day and night, the food availability is different. While in Western Australia, it's not as cold usually. We have some extreme nights where it was really cold. So we still need to understand a bit more about what are the cues to start using Torpor, and maybe it's external cues, maybe it's more from internal cues. We still have a bit more to learn about it.
And the last question I have for you is, one thing that came to mind after speaking to you is I had sort of assumed that the champion migrants are shorebirds, but you also pointed out your studies on passerines. Is there a difference in the migration that passerines do versus shorebirds? Does it have to do with size? Because the passerines are smaller, they migrate smaller distances. What are some differences?
So the main difference, first, the size, not necessarily, because there are very little shorebirds, like the stints that are very small. So it's not really the size. The obvious main difference is the places where they have to stop, because shorebirds need shores. So they they migrate through. So our birds from South Australia to the islands, to Taiwan or to the Yellow Sea, and from there to the Arctic. And the passerines that can just stop everywhere that they have food. So in Africa, for example, so they migrate along from South Africa, probably the Horn of Africa, and then Sub-Sahara, which is a really, really rich area in years where they don't have drought. And then some can cross the Mediterranean Sea. Some migrate via Israel, so along the coast, all the way to Europe. So they are less limited, or less limited in their choice of area where to stop, because shorebirds have to look for the next shore.
Yes.
So I guess that's the main, yeah.
And the north-south migration that most shorebirds seem to do, does it have to do with winds? Because I was just thinking, why can't they go horizontally from shore to shore? Because oceans are everywhere and they can go distances.
Yeah, but they are going between northern and southern hemisphere. So I gave the extreme examples of really, they are really crossing the between north and southern hemisphere. Some shorebirds, and other bird species, so they migrate, for example, from breeding areas to the equator. They don't necessarily have to cross the equator to the southern hemisphere, but that's actually another study that we did, because it probably depends on the food availability. So the food availability for the shorebirds, for example, is probably higher in temperate areas. So from breeding sites in the northern hemisphere, when the winter starts, so they move south to where spring in the southern hemisphere starts, and then they save energy and thermoregulation while they have high food abundance. So it's really worthwhile crossing the equator, so they can have both nice weather and lots of food. But it definitely depends on the species. But we don't know about a lot of species that do horizontal migration. Most of them will do north to south, because the changes of the season and the increased food availability in temperate areas. So when you go further from the equator, so that's the most common migration route.
And really last question, which I ask all my guests, are there any birds that inspire you or that you love?
I think it is the Ruddy turnstone. Maybe you guessed, because I spoke a lot about it. I think because it's the first bird that I studied, because I always liked animals and birds. And when I came to Australia and I went to the field with my PhD supervisor, and that was the first bird that I think we captured, and I held in my hand and I heard the story and I saw the band, and it came back from Russia, from the Arctic, all the way to that small beach in South Australia. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. And I think that's really got me into the migration. How did you do that? How did you migrate all the way to the Arctic and back safely? So I think, and it is a champion.
Dr. Rotman, thank you so much for being part of the Bird Podcast.
Thank you so much.